Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Lunch with Books, live stream and in person. We're doing the hybrid today. Some people we know are watching from home. If you have a cell phone, please turn it off or put it on vibrate or whatever it is you kids do. A couple of announcements before we begin. For one thing, if you're not on our email list, would like to be for future programs, just put your name in the box over there along with your email address. That's kind of an important bit of information. We will be giving away one of these books of Jack's. At the end of the program, I'll be drawing a number for your table and then for your seat. And so we won't have a name, but we'll figure out who you are. It's going to work, I promise. It'll work. Some tables have more than the authorized amount of people. We'll just have to figure it out. Okay. If you want to be a zombie in a movie that I'm making, yes, that's right, I'm making a zombie movie that will promote future programs, get in touch with me. Stop and talk to me, and I'll give you the details. I need extras. That means you will be transformed into a zombie, so no complaints. But it will be an award-winning film, and like I said, details to be announced. Next Tuesday on the 28th, also in person and online, we were legends in our own minds. This is a new book from Carter Taylor Seton, who's a West Virginia author who's been here before. Her husband, Richard Cobb, was a manager of a civic center for many years, so he had to deal with a lot of famous and semi-famous people with various different personalities. So that'll be next week, and in 2 weeks, Canal Coal Oil Days. Canal Coal was one of the products that was supposed to replace whale oil back in 1859. And this novel was written by a man. It's all about statehood. It has lots of content, and it was discovered recently by his great-grandson as a manuscript that had never been published. Now, LWB Press has published it, and the great-grandson, Mr. Watts, will be here to tell you about it. He is an English professor from Michigan State University. Our guest today is Jack Bodkin. He's a retired certified public accountant. Briarhill to Brooklyn is his first book. He was born in Brooklyn in 1947. And for the first 2 years of his life, his family lived at 325 Clinton Avenue, about 100 yards from his great-great-uncle Dominic's house at 290 Clinton. In 1950, the family moved to the post-World War II community of Merrick, Long Island. After graduating from Chaminade High School and Wheeling College, he returned to Long Island in 1969 and worked in New York City until 1977. He now lives in Wheeling with his wife, Christine. She brought some brownies over there. Get your brownies. And they're Yorkie. We know brownies. Thank you. And the Yorkie's name is Lilly. Here is Jack Bodkin.
Thank you very much, Sean, for a kind introduction. It's really great to have Briarhill to Brooklyn introduced by someone with as Irish a name as Sean Duffy. And Sean with the Alfada also. Thank you very much, Sean. As I discussed in the author's note, can you all hear me? Tom, can you hear me okay? Good. Thank you. As I discussed in the author's note to Briarhill to Brooklyn, I do realize that Bodkin is not the most Irish name out there. Years ago, growing up on Long Island, people would guess that our family was all different nationalities. It was not unusual for people to think that we were Russian. On Long Island, Russian Jewish was a pretty normal combination. But today the Bodkin flag still flies proudly over Ayr Square in Galway, along with the flags of the other 13 families who comprise the ancient tribes of Galway. It's really exciting to be here today. I don't know if you can imagine, certainly 5 years ago, I never would have imagined this. The library used to be our client, and I'd spend time up in the West Virginia room working on their books. But I never thought I'd be back here in this role. There are a lot of familiar faces out here and faces I don't know. On the live stream, there should be people from Ireland, from England, my Wheeling College classmates from all across the country. So it's been a long process that brings me here today. I retired from my CPA firm back in 2013. It didn't take me long to figure out that I really couldn't play golf all the time. And so I needed something else to do. So it was probably the winter of 2014 when I started to work on my family's ancestry. I signed up for Ancestry.com and I got started. It was very easy, actually. Ancestry does cost a little bit of money. There are free versions to Family Search, but it's not terribly expensive. It's good to be lucky in doing any kind of research, and I was lucky a few times. My first bit of good fortune was finding a doctoral thesis that was written by an American woman named Diane Dunnigan. Her thesis topic was Irish return migration from America at the turn of the 19th century. It was submitted to the National University of Ireland in October of 2011. And one of the individuals that Diane researched and documented in her thesis was a man named Dominic Bodkin. I talked with Diane a couple of times on the telephone, and it's just as a matter of coincidence, her grandfather is buried here in Wheeling, out at Peninsula Cemetery. Actually, Christine and I went out there on a snowy day and tried to find it, but it was covered with snow. So, the family tree that I eventually did put together was just the usual tree with names and dates of birth, dates of death. And I have to admit, it was of very, very little interest to my family. Their eyes glazed over. And I was afraid that the history would be lost. Not so much the history of the names and the dates of birth and death, but the history of the struggles of my Irish ancestors, their bravery, their journey to freedom and opportunity that led to relative prosperity that we all enjoy here in America today. I decided I had to tell the family story in a different way, a way that would be more memorable, more long-lasting. So I decided in December of 2016 to write a book, and I got started. I didn't know where I was going or what I was doing. I had no idea. And at first, I was very much afraid to make a mistake. I think you can probably realize where I'm coming from there. But I learned to write down what I was thinking, to type out what I was thinking. I learned that I could, I would, I should, and I did correct and fix and move and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And a little more than 4 years later, in January of 2021, the final draft was submitted to my third editor. So it's just last January. It gives you a little bit of a picture of the time frame that this went on from 2016, maybe 2014 to just this year. And I have to thank my wife, Christine, for being very patient. At some point, probably in 2016, I moved into the living room as my office. I have stacks of stuff and documents and folders. And in January of this year, I moved into the dining room too. And so, you've been very patient, Christine. Thank you. There are really three things that I want to tell you about today. First is a little bit about my experience with the self-publishing industry. Next, there's some Irish history that I think is very important for people to understand. I guess the Irish history that we'll talk about is really the backstory to Briarhill, to Brooklyn, and to the 32 million Americans who identify their heritage as Irish. And finally, while I'm talking about the first two, I'll give you a peek inside the pages of Briarhill to Brooklyn. Libraries are about learning, and life is about learning. And I had a lot to learn as I wrote Briarhill. I taught myself the basics of Microsoft Word, but I still type with two little fat fingers. And I learned how to play with Photoshop a little bit, a free version of Photoshop, as I envisioned what my cover would look like. Covers are very important. Everything you read about publishing will speak to the importance of a book's cover. How it will look on a bookstore shelf has to be very carefully designed. But maybe more important to a self-published author is how it will look in Amazon's tiny little online image. Related to my cover, I had another bit of luck. While checking the copyright status of the few images that I actually use in the book, I found one where the copyright was not in the public domain or otherwise available for me to use. There was a picture of Irish immigrants huddled in the steerage compartment of a coffin ship. The painting is titled Below Deck. And I was able to find the artist online, an Englishman named Rodney Sharma. Using the contact information on his website, I sent him an email. So here I am, not knowing where I'm going with this. I just sent this artist an email and said, can I use your picture? I don't know what I'm doing. A couple of days later, Rodney replied and said, sure, just send me a copy of your book when it gets published. Yeah, very encouraging, right? Very encouraging. There was one other painting I was planning to use, and I had actually included it in my manuscript for years. And it was a painting of passengers on the gangway of the vessel. And during my copyright checking process, I actually studied it pretty hard. And I realized, hard to imagine I didn't pick this up sooner, but the passengers were getting off the ship. And I needed passengers getting on the ship. I needed a boarding seat. And so back to the internet again. I kept searching for a boarding scene, the boarding scene that I wanted. And after a couple of weeks, I wound up back at Rodney's website. He's a prolific artist. He has lots of pictures of sailing ships, actually. And right there on his website was a button, a thing you could press on. And don't you know, it said commission a painting. And so after another month of emails back and forth with Rodney, we all agreed to the basic elements of the scene that I wanted, and we agreed to the timing of his painting and to the price. Rodney read the first half of my manuscript, so this is back at this point almost 2 years ago. He read the first half of the manuscript so that he could understand the characters that I had created and the scene that I had already described on the pier, the dock in Galway. He had to figure out how many people were on the pier, how many masts did the ship have, was it cloudy or sunny, was it morning or afternoon, so that he could get the angle of the sun correct in his painting. And after about 6 months from that, he sent me a sketch, an oil sketch. And we talked about the oil sketch in emails back and forth, and a couple of questions I had, a couple of things I wanted a little bit differently. And then I guess we had one FaceTime call, actually. It's the only time I've ever talked to him, it's like one FaceTime call. And then after 6 months more of actual painting, went back and started from scratch. He was finished. And I was able to email a high definition image that he sent me to my cover design. I got to name the painting, which I didn't know I was going to do. It's a pretty cool thing. I asked him what the name of the painting was. He said, that's up to you. I was thrilled. So it's called Opportunity, and you'll see it on the cover, and it wraps around the cover, and it's also all by itself in chapter 11. At times, learning about the self-publishing process was a full-time job. Editing is clearly important. And as I found out, there are different levels of editing. There's developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, and proofreading. I think we all understand the idea of proofreading, but that's really the last step. It was a frightening experience to meet with my first editor. She lived in Wheeling, and we met in person. It was like a job interview for me. I was nervous showing someone I didn't know, words I had written that I hoped could become a book. That was very nice. We met out at the coffee shop on Washington Avenue. One of the first things she taught me was that there are 3 different dashes. I think I use a lot of dashes when I write. Okay? And to me, a dash was a dash. I didn't know there are 3 kinds. It's something that accounting majors just don't know about. But since you're here in the library, maybe you do. There's an M dash, M as in mother, an N dash, N as in never, and the regular hyphen that we all use to split up a word. Who knew? Next, she was on to the Oxford comma. That's another thing that Marvin Franklin didn't teach me in advanced accounting at Lilly College in 1969. A writer also needs test readers, and maybe they're called beta readers. And in the year before I published Briarhill, I had 6 or 7 people who volunteered to be my readers, and some of them are here today. These are individuals, some I knew and some I didn't know at all, who put in an incredible amount of time and gave me tremendous feedback. They read the whole book when it was a manuscript, and it took time. If I had ever taken a creative writing course, I probably would have known that a writer trying to sell a book should use fewer words, not more, when trying to describe a scene or to tell a story. Over the last 5 years, I've learned that less is actually more. A couple of years ago, getting near to the end of my writing process and feeling pretty accomplished about myself, I Googled how to win the Pulitzer Prize in literature. We've all done that, right? Google searches lead you from one thing to another, and on that day, my Google search brought me to a very useful article. Listen carefully while I read this. 43 Useless Words is an article by Diana Urban that I probably found just from a completely random Google search about writing. Diana Urban's useless word list includes the following words: that, really, very, just, totally, completely, probably, absolutely, literally, and about 30 other words and phrases including dialogue tags, as in, I asked, she said, she replied. Sometimes you need these words and phrases, but lots of times you don't need them. And I'm not pretending to be perfect at this, but listen carefully again while I read. I could have started this section by saying, 43 Useless Words is an article by Diana Urban I found from a random Google search about writing. If you noticed, I eliminated 4 of my original 22 words. I eliminated that, probably, just, and completely. After reading Urban's article, I took a message to heart, and using the search function in Microsoft Word, I eliminated 2,000 useless words from my 112,000 word manuscript. And I'd go back and read those sentences again. Of those 2,000 words, I'll bet you 1,000 of them were the word that. You just don't need it all the time. And it's awkward, but once I got used to it, everything read better, everything was smoother. I've learned a lot, but I still don't know a single thing about the consistent use of a comma. Everybody has a different plan with a comma. Google searches on the self-publishing process take you everywhere. One day I wound up at Readsy.com. Readsy is an internet marketplace that matches online freelance service providers with authors trying to get their books published. Using professionals I found on their website, I had my maps done by a cartographer in London. Then I hired editors and designers located in New Hampshire, San Francisco, and Austin, Texas. I had other proposals from freelancers on the website in Ireland, South Africa, and Australia. The process to publication continued. The next editor, the book interior designer, the cover designer, and finally the proofreader. My book's interior designer handled all of the formatting specifications that are required by Amazon and the ebook conversion. And finally, on February 26th of this year, the upload. And in the morning, it was done. In the months before publication, I went back and forth on the title. I've had several titles over the years. And in the subtitle, I really didn't work on the subtitle, I don't think, until probably the last 6 months, in the middle of last year. I started off with poverty to prosperity, then moved to freedom to prosperity. And I think eventually I figured out I didn't really like the word prosperity. It sounded a little bit arrogant for the cover. It did. And I wound up making my decision to go with freedom to opportunity. There are obvious marketing implications to the words that are on the cover of the book, the front cover, the back cover, and on the flaps. And I always had to remember that Briarhill to Brooklyn is an immigration story. We're all immigrants, right? Looking around the room, I think we're all immigrants. And that's what Briarhill to Brooklyn is about. Without being too political, the topic of immigration is timely. Clearly, a significant number of our news stories over the past several years have dealt with immigration. Most of those stories relate to immigration at our southern border. But in the middle of the 19th century, the Irish migration to the west dominated the ports of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Quebec in Canada. Or maybe the Irishman's journey began as a prisoner being transported by the British to a penal colony in Australia for a crime as minor as stealing a loaf of bread to feed his family. The story I tell in Briarhill to Brooklyn begins in the middle of Ireland's Great Famine years, 1845 to 1850. Over its history, Ireland has suffered many famines, but the Great Famine, known in Irish as An Gorta Mór, was a period of 4 to 5 years, which included 3 separate growing seasons, during which a blight ruined the annual potato crops. The terrible blight affected most of Ireland, but was probably most impactful in Western Ireland, where for hundreds of years, families had lived on the potato as the staple of their diet. You might ask, why did the Irish just eat potatoes? Did they really just eat potatoes? And I think the answer is basically yes. Until recently, Quinnipiac University in Connecticut housed what was arguably the largest Irish famine museum in the world. Their website details part of the answer to the question about potatoes. During the 16th and 17th centuries, England not only conquered Ireland by military force, but under Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s, the British drove hundreds of thousands off their land in Northern Ireland. These Irish Catholics were then forcibly relocated to areas in the west of Ireland. It's called the Connaught, where the land was only suitable for growing potatoes. If you've seen pictures of the 4 to 5 foot high stone walls that are in County Galway and the rest of Western Ireland, just weaving up and down, across to the road and over the hill, the landowners and their Irish tenant farmers, the British landowners and their Irish tenant farmers, might have been marking property lines with those walls. But over centuries, they also had to move the stones to get to the tillable soil where only potatoes would grow. The British landlords made their Irish farmers feed themselves, and the potato grew plentifully in the soil they found. And for 200 years, the Irish lived on the magical vegetable. Magical? I bet my great-grandmother didn't know, but the potatoes she fed her family every day for years were cholesterol-free, zero saturated fat, low in sodium, high in vitamins C, B, potassium, and the all-important fiber. This probably does not include McDonald's French fries. but the three separate blights which occurred between 1845 and 1850 killed the potato crops, turning them overnight into black, smelling, rotting mush. And now, without the potato, Ireland starved. In the middle of these famine years, the winter of 1847, which is known in Ireland as Black 47, was very harsh. Harsh enough that it temporarily killed the blight, but so harsh that it also killed thousands of starving Irishmen. In the decades surrounding the Great Famine, perhaps a couple of million Irishmen migrated across the Atlantic. Maybe another million who couldn't leave Ireland died of starvation and typhus. Hopefully, I'm getting a little local here. Hopefully you realize that there are less than 2 million people in West Virginia. The last census just came out, and it was about 1.7 million, right? 1.7 million, something like that. So 1 million Irishmen dying of starvation and typhus during the famine years is the equivalent of every other person in every West Virginia household. Every other person along Miller Street, or 18th Street in Warwood, every other neighbor, or in your individual family setting, it would be your spouse and 2 of your children, all dead in the next 5 years. The British had ruled Ireland with an iron fist since the Anglo-Norman invasion in the 12th century, and as history has unfolded, the Great Famine years have highlighted hundreds of years of mistreatment the Irish endured at the hands of the British. If you look up the word famine in the dictionary, you'll find the predominant definition as extreme scarcity of food. But research on the potato famine will show you that during the famine years, there was no scarcity of food. 75% of Irish soil was devoted to crops: wheat, oats, barley, peas, beans, and onions. These crops were called money crops, grown for export only. They were not grown to feed the Irish. Cattle and sheep were raised on Irish pastures and exported to the mainland of Europe. In 1847 alone, 4,000 ships carried exports from Irish ports to Europe, to England. And corn shipped from America to Ireland never received British approval to be unloaded. And as a result, the corn rotted on the packet ships in Galway Harbor. All of this while Irishmen starved. If you look up the word starvation in the dictionary, you'll find the predominant definition as suffering or death caused by hunger. Jerry Mulvihill is an Irish author who's published a wonderful book titled The Truth Behind the Irish Famine. It's full of dozens of beautiful paintings and sketches. It could be considered a coffee table book. It's a good size book. But it's really a history book that will give you a better insight into the distinction between the definitions of famine and starvation. Let me be perfectly clear. The Brits didn't cause the Great Famine. The potato blight did. But the British Parliament certainly turned their backs to the Irish condition and allowed the starvation of the Irish people to happen. Maybe on a lighter note, you also might ask, before the blight, how many potatoes did an Irishman eat each day? A Google search will yield a variety of answers to this question, but the nearly unbelievable truth probably lies between 8 to 12 pounds of potatoes. Lots of times you do on that search, you'll see 14 pounds for a working man. The nutritious lumper, as the potatoes were the main Irish for an Irish family at every meal, day after day, year after year. Briarhill to Brooklyn tells the story of a family, my family, that was lucky enough to escape Ireland during these famine years. They escaped their beloved homeland with their lives and barely the clothes on their backs. It's the story of John and Eleanor Bodkin, who both born around 1800, and 7 of their children. The children ranged in age from 19 to 7. The children were Kate, Biddy, Dominic, Martin, Lawrence, John, and Nellie. The jacket of the hardcover introduces the story with a few questions. Was it the prospect of starvation, the snows of Black 47, or the fear of typhus that made the Bodkins leave? Or was it the dream of American freedom and opportunity that drove the family from Galway onto an Irish coffin ship known as Cushlamachree? Their destination was Brooklyn. An unimaginable hurdle confronted the 7 young Bodkin siblings only days after docking in New York. Would the fever get them too? But they managed to survive into adulthood as they were led by their 2 oldest brothers, Dominic and Merrick. Briarhill to Brooklyn is a novel grounded in facts. Its main characters are real people, my ancestors. And the timeline, locations, and major events are generally historically accurate. All of that seems to classify Briarhill as creative nonfiction versus historical fiction. It seems to be a fine line. For years, I thought I was writing historical fiction, but apparently in historical fiction, the main characters are fictional. The locations, the settings, the background characters are real, but the main characters are fictional. In Briarhill to Brooklyn, some of the story is fact and some is fiction, but much more of it is fiction than fact. And the difference between the two is never very clear. There are 3 things that I hope I accomplished with Briarhill to Brooklyn. First, I wanted Briarhill to be educational. Readers will learn something about the plight of the Irish, and my family, I hope for generations to come, will know their ancestors' story. Second, I thought that the story needed some emotion. The Irish are emotional people. You know that. A few readers have told me they fought tears at the seaport arrival scene and at Dominic's funeral. And some laughed out loud when Martin spit his chewing tobacco into the soldiers' fire in New Orleans. Third, of course, I wanted the story to be entertaining, and I hope that it is. In Briarhill to Brooklyn, I use a first-person narrator as well as a third-person omniscient narrator. It was a little bit dangerous, risky, to switch back and forth between first person and third person. But I wanted to expand Martin's character. He's my great-grandfather, after all. And late in my writing process, he became my first-person storyteller. In 10 chapters throughout Briarhill to Brooklyn, 66-year-old Martin speaks from his location in the final scene of the book in 1902, as he flashes back to different episodes of his life. The family's journey from Briarhill to Brooklyn begins in early February of 1848. And in the prologue, 12-year-old Martin is walking with his father from their Briarhill cottage into Galway City to see Uncle Lawrence. Uncle Lawrence, who is actually the second Catholic bishop of the Diocese of Galway. And Martin's father, affectionately called Dad, apparently wants to talk to his brother-in-law about the family leaving Ireland. The father and son walk down the big road, the Boramore it's called, from the hills north of Galway onto William Street, the main road in the old city. They walk along the ancient gray cobblestones of the narrow street, which is lined by 2-story stone buildings already more than 500 years old. The air is smoky from the peasants' open fires. For 3 years, the famine and now typhus have ravaged Galway City, and Martin sees hundreds of starving peasants in a soup line. Martin's first-person voice speaks in the prologue. At the bottom of the Bore Moor, we walked through a muddy parcel of land. It was all that remained of Galway's ancient city gates. Peasants overflowed the space, and large families like our own, crowding around small fires. We entered Galway City and passed hundreds more peasants of all generations, waiting in a soup line which wound along the gray cobblestones of William Street. Families waiting for hours to get a cup of watery soup made with some meat and vegetables. And if they were fortunate, they collected a small sack of cornmeal to be boiled into some liquid mush. Dad put his big hand on my shoulder, and mine was around his hip as we walked past a family huddled in front of a shop. The mother and father wept over the body of their son. His young brothers and sisters held each other, standing silently by their parents. I didn't want to look, but I did. And I found the face of the dead boy. He might have been the same age as me, but it was hard to tell. His sunken cheeks, spindly limbs, and swollen belly made reckoning his years difficult. The lad's dark eyes were frightening, as was the soft, downy hair that had grown on his face while he starved. Don't look, Martin, Dad almost whispered as he guided me away. In front of the soup line was Old Witch's Castle on Upper Abbeygate Street, where 3 elderly nuns, Sisters of Mercy, Dad said, ladled soup from a steaming cauldron into tin cups. A fat British overseer barked at one of the sisters. Remember, Papist, only 1 cup per person. "12-year-old Martin is proud that his father chose him to make the walk into Galway City. His father chose him and not his older brother Dominic. Martin and Dominic were middle siblings, less than 2 years apart in age. Not quite Irish twins, but close. Brothers, but very different people. Dominic clearly is the main character in the family and in my story. A lifelong bachelor, his character traits seem unchanging throughout the 50 years we know him in Briarhill to Brooklyn. Brilliant, industrious, mentally and emotionally fearless and tireless. As a young man still in medical school, he was a fledgling surgeon on the Civil War battlefields near Mobile, Alabama. Martin, on the other hand, was also a Civil War veteran and later an ironmonger with his own shop. Ultimately, he becomes the progenitor of a large family of New York Bodkins. Martin definitely has the rougher personality of the 2 brothers. Perhaps he has the more flawed, but more human character. He teases his younger brother Lawrence incessantly, never quits. He's loyal. He fights a bigger boy to protect his sister's honor. He is convinced that he could kill another as he went to war for his new country against the South's rebels. In chapter 15, maybe, just maybe, Martin flirts with Maria, an older, pretty girl who is also an immigrant passenger on the Cushlamachree. Still just 12 years old, he is strong at his father's funeral and committed to seeing his parents' goals, freedom and opportunity for the family, are attained. Briarhill to Brooklyn gives no clear definition of Martin's formal education, and as the first-person narrator, his spoken English isn't very polished. He uses me instead of mine. As you probably heard in the prologue, he said me brother instead of my brother. And he drops some Irish F-bombs too in the course of the book. But he's a good father and a family man who likes whiskey and baseball. And he can't be all bad, right? I'm not giving too much away, but after enduring the incredible condition in the steerage compartment of an Irish coffin ship for 5 weeks, the family finally arrives in New York City. Maybe you visited New York, the Bodkin ship, the Cushlamachree, docks at South Street in Lower Manhattan. In 1848, the pier at South Street is just a short walk to the slums and the tenements of a hellhole known back in the day as the 5 Points. Today, South Street Seaport, a tourist attraction, is just a few blocks from the canyons of Wall Street, City Hall, the site of the World Trade Center, Chinatown, Little Italy. In chapter 27, there's chaos on the pier as the Cushlamachree docks at South Street. The wharf at South Street in Lower Manhattan was about 250 feet across and 50 feet deep. The surviving 116 passengers, plus the crew of 10, joined the welcoming crowd of another 100 on the pier. Some in the waiting crowd had vegetable carts. Some were roasting chickens, ribs of beef, onions, even potatoes. They cooked over red-hot smoky fires. The smell of the sizzling beef and chicken fat was so enticing to the hungry passengers and crew that many were spending their remaining money to get some food into their empty bellies. Street hawkers approached the passengers with offers of lodging, work, transportation, and ale. The hustlers even said sometimes to the male passengers that female companionship was available. 4 street musicians were playing for coins in the middle of the crowd. The musicians produced ballads and love songs in the passengers' native Irish language. The troupe had just a fiddle, a flute, and a bowrung, which blended magically with the sweet but strong voice of a beautiful young woman. She had black hair and brilliant blue eyes, eager to steal a man's imagination. Her songs filled the new immigrants with the hope that much of what they loved about Ireland would be found on the streets and in the neighborhoods of New York. People often ask me, who is your favorite character? There are a lot of characters, I know that. It was a bigger family. But people ask who is your favorite, and this is difficult for me to answer. It's hard for me to pick one character. My favorite should be one of the siblings. Makes sense. I've spent so much time trying to be in the minds and in the hearts of each of the brothers and sisters. For a variety of reasons, Martin is, to me, who's my great-grandfather, an obvious choice. But it could easily be Dominic. Dominic is so dominant in the story. One of the other characters could be my favorite. Uncle Lawrence, the Bishop of Galway, was clearly a hero to the family. They depended on him. There are a lot of fictional characters in Briarhill to Brooklyn too, and I don't know if it's usual or normal or not, but I used the names of many of my friends throughout my life as my characters. In the pages to Briarhill, you'll meet B.J. Fitzpatrick, Father Fitzpatrick. B.J. was never a priest. Jamie Flynn, Captain Bruce Bemke, and Inspector Paul Nealon. You'll probably also recognize the names of a few of my wheeling friends too. To some degree, these characters portray the personalities of my friends, and to some degrees, they're totally polar opposites. And I'll never tell you which is which. But today, I think my favorite character might be Nellie. I had a lot of fun writing about Nellie. My granddaughter, 10-year-old Sally Plemich, did Nellie's sketch of Galway Girl at the family's departure. Nellie is the youngest of the Bodkin siblings. She's 7 years old at the time of the family's voyage to America. Can you imagine being 7 years old, being in the steerage compartment of a coffin ship for 5 weeks? 5 weeks. How do you recover? She was too young to have much of a friendship with her older sisters. And after the events that transpire when the family arrives in Brooklyn, Nellie misses her mother terribly. And that seems to have impacted her throughout the rest of her life. I must admit that several years ago, my old friend Terry Gurley, someone many of you will remember from his years at the Schrader Law Firm, or from his performances at Towngate Theater. Terry read an early manuscript of my book and suggested that I shouldn't be afraid to have that crazy aunt. And after my discussion with Terry, Nellie may have evolved into that crazy aunt. In Irish literature and Irish folklore, fairies play an important part. Irish fairies seem to have a significant role surrounding childbirth in small children, especially boys. Throughout Briarhill to Brooklyn, Nellie has a friend who is a fairy, and she's a good fairy. Her name is Siv. Siv, of course, can only be seen by Nellie, and Nellie is the only one who communicates with Siv. Nellie is a teenager in the second half of Briarhill to Brooklyn when I finally get around to explaining her relationship with Siv. Nellie remembered most of the things that happened in her life when she was a 6-year-old in Briarhill, but she did not have a clear recollection of too many things that happened when she was 5, and even less of what happened when she was only 4. She remembered nothing of her life before she was 4. As the baby of a family, almost by definition, your siblings were all bigger than you were, and of course, smarter than you were. Those were her first memories. She was living in a world of giants. She was living in a world where everyone was smart, and she was not. Everyone thought she was needy, and someone was always taking care of her, never allowing her independence. She was 6 when she first met Siv. Nellie had ventured over the meadow behind the cottage in Briarhill, toward a stream to pick some daffodils. At first, Nellie thought she was asleep and dreaming, a good dream about a beautiful girl who was about 18 years old, with long, curly blonde hair. Siv was a statuesque girl, wearing a flowing diaphanous gown made of gold and white silk. The girl floated. She hovered next to Nellie. Clearly, the most significant thing that happened in the United States after the Bodkins docked at South Street in 1848 had to be the Civil War. 16 years after arriving penniless and orphaned in America, somehow Dominic had saved enough money to go to medical school. And in 1864, he enrolled at the University of the City of New York. Now it's NYU. But he withdrew the next year to join the Army as a nurse. One of the most significant pieces of family history I discovered in my research was a series of letters that Dominic wrote to his youngest brother, John, in 1865 during his time in the South. The original letters give tremendous insight into the young medical student's thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Dominic's letters to John are the foundation of the 6 or 7 Civil War chapters. Dominic sailed to the South on a Union Army transport ship, along with 250 conscripted recruits and several doctors from Philadelphia and New York. When they arrived at Mobile, Alabama, the battle at Spanish Fort had been raging for a week, and doctors went to work in the medical tent, supporting one of the final battles of the Civil War. Chapter 52, Battles. Dominic is working as part of a medical team with Dr. Ed Fox, one of the Philadelphia physicians. The catastrophic nature and sheer volume of the injuries were nothing the physicians from New York and Philadelphia ever dealt with before. 70% of the soldiers' wounds were to their extremities, arms and legs blown apart by cannonballs, or soft lead bullets called mini balls. The surgeon's first goal was to save a life. Next was to keep a limb. Often they did not achieve either. They performed amputations with almost nothing to reduce the pain for the soldier, except for perhaps some chloroform or a bottle of whiskey. Most of the injured soldiers outside of the medical tent bled to death from already having lost an arm or a leg before one of the surgeons was able to attend to a bloody stump. The soldier did not live long with an artery spewing blood into the mud. Dominic, helping with this man's leg, Fox instructed the younger Bodkin as he wiped particles of red and gray matter from the bone saw he had used on the last soldier. He wiped the bone saw on an already bloody rag. I'll cut through the femur at about the middle of the thigh, and you scrape the edges of the bone smooth so that it won't work back through his skin. 13 years after the end of the Civil War, the full impact of the Industrial Revolution was being experienced in America. And practicing medicine back in Brooklyn, Dr. Bodkin's life had changed. A woman named Mary McCann was his nurse and in charge of the doctor's office at the corner of Jay and Sand Street, just a couple of blocks from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. John Alpers was his personal coachman. Sounds a little like a chauffeur, but his personal coachman. The doctor's schedule was busy. It's now 1877, chapter 56, a well-oiled machine. The office at Jay and Sands seemed as though it had always been home to Mary. Patients were comfortable in the examining rooms, plenty of storage for extra supplies, and patient supplies and patient charts, and the doctor was happy. There was a place for everything, and everything was in its place. But both Mary and Dominic agreed he was wasting too much time traveling in Brooklyn's traffic. Horse-drawn delivery carts and large passenger carriages were double and triple parked on the streets in front of shops and businesses, making it nearly impossible for John Alpers' two-horse, four-wheel carriage to pass. It seemed to Mary that every other day, Dominic would return to the office from the hospital, only to be sent back into the congested traffic immediately to see a very sick patient at her home in another part of Brooklyn. Too much time in the carriage, too much wasted time, and Mary knew she had to fix this. Martin's life had moved along also. In 1884, the small businessman with his own ironmongery was in the process of turning the operation of his hardware store over to his oldest son, Stanley. Some days in July, the guys took the afternoon off to go to a baseball game. In Brooklyn in 1884, their team wasn't the Pittsburgh Pirates. It was the Brooklyn Atlantics. Chapter 57. The bum couldn't throw a strike. Again, Martin speaks in his first-person voice. Strike one. You're fucking blind, ump. The ball was high. I remember how Stanley cupped his hands around his mouth when he hollered at the umpire who was calling balls and strikes. A chorus of catcalls and boos from the other Brooklyn fans made the umpire glare into the grandstand and signal that the pitch was at the batter's waist. It was right down the middle. He shouted back to no one in particular. With 2 outs in the bottom of the 6th inning, the Brooklyn Atlantics trailed 6-2, and it looked like our rivals, the New York Metropolitans, would win again. I had hoped we might pull off the upset against the Metropolitans after Brooklyn's Charlie Householder and Tug Wilson hit back-to-back 4-baggers to start off the 5th to give us the lead. But the Atlantic's 2-win advantage quickly vanished. Leading off the top of the 6th, our pitcher, Sam Kimber, was tagged for a pair of doubles by the Metropolitans' third baseman, Dasher Troy, and their big catcher, Henry Oxley. Then Kimber was plagued with his frequent control issues and had to give up the mound to Jimmy Conway. I went to take a piss while they changed pitchers. The bum couldn't throw a strike, Stanley. I complained when I got back to my seat. You want something to eat? One of each, Billy. I called to the guy hawking bags of peanuts and popcorn. The men sitting next to us passed the bags down the row of fans, and I sent a quarter back to Billy. As usual, Stanley took the peanuts, and I ate the popcorn. As you can see, Briarhill in County Galway, Ireland, and Brooklyn, New York, were vastly different places. And life had changed 180 degrees for the brothers during their years in Brooklyn. They were luckier than most of the Irish who migrated in the middle of the 19th century. Their journey to freedom and opportunity was successful in just one generation. That about wraps up my time for today. I hope you've enjoyed a little bit of Irish history and my experience with the self-publishing process. I also hope that the peek inside the pages of Briarhill to Brooklyn was fun and interesting. If you haven't already, I think when you do read Briarhill, you'll find it educational and a little emotional and very enjoyable. I have copies to sell and to sign for you after we do a drawing for a free book. Sean said he would do a drawing. My guess is he's right here to take care of it. Today has been an amazing experience for me. I thank you so much for coming here to the library, to lunch with books, just to hear me talk about Briarhill. Thank you. Oh, that's right. Very, very good. Thank you. So we'll do question first, and then we'll do the drawing because people are on live stream.
I have a question about the stone walls over in my western Ireland. Now, the father, I think you wrote, went out to work on stone walls because they
It probably depended. So let me repeat the question, because when I watch it online, I can hear the answer, but I can never hear the question. So the question related to the stone walls in Galway. The father in the book, Dad, went out and worked on the walls. And was he paid? Okay, and who paid him? So I think at some point, the diocese paid people to work on the famine walls. Also, the British had a make-work project that they ran for a long time. But actually, at the height of the famine, they stopped paying people to work on the walls. So they made very little. But
were they called the hunger walls?
the famine walls, I think.
I think that's what
Yeah, the famine walls.
Thank you.
Luke?
Jack, what was the hardest part of the process?
So I'm sure in the beginning I thought that writing it, and I can remember my daughter Kate telling me in the beginning after the first draft, you have to show me, don't tell me. And so adding conversations to, instead of describing that as the family rode in the cart, that there was a clacháns that was torn down buildings and the people were standing around. Instead of describing that, I put it into a conversation. So I was showing rather than telling what was going on. In the beginning, I thought that was the hardest part. Basically going all the way through it and taking out all of my telling and changing it into showing. But I think in the last year and a half, the self-publishing process itself, it was overwhelming. There are so many people, websites where people want to help you for money. And if you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what you're doing, you're always afraid you're going to get scammed, right? That there's something wrong with this, and what's the real bottom line? And so that was very, very difficult for me. I would say that might have been at that point the most difficult thing to work with. And I do wake up early, and I'm a morning person. So very frequently, I'm up at 5:30, certainly by 6. And I'd probably think, I'm not a good sleeper, so I'd probably think about things as I was trying to sleep overnight. And so I'd get up every morning, 7 days a week. I had no place else to go, I'm retired. I'd work on the book. And frequently I'd work until noon, something like that. I think more time than I ever thought that I would spend. And sometimes I shocked myself that I'd sit down and I would have a new chapter I was going to start. And before I knew it, I had written 2,000 words. I just didn't notice it, I'm sure when we were all in high school and college, we got an assignment to write a 100-word essay, right, or one typewritten page. And the most important thing, the question that we had about it was, is a word that counts as a word? I mean, those were the thoughts I had. So I'd be shocked at some point that I'd wind up, so Microsoft Word counts your words for you. It's always at the bottom of the page. And I'd be shocked, but I wrote in the morning almost always.
Jack, you have a question?
I gave it 5 weeks.
Yeah, I think you wanted more of a mile.
Oh, 3,300 miles. It's 3,300 miles from Galway. So most of the Irish on their voyage wound up going from somewhere in Ireland, probably Dublin, to Liverpool, England. And then from Liverpool, they would sail to New York, basically on back past Ireland, all the way around Ireland. And then the voyage itself, you'd think that from, I'll draw a map here, which way I would. So from Galway, you're on to New York, it's barely straight across. But the wind is coming at you if you go straight across, so they couldn't go straight across. And somewhere throughout the process, they learned that from Galway, they had to come down below the Azores, where they would catch the westerly winds that would be favorable to bring them up to New York. Because otherwise, they would start going straight across, and sometimes they'd be gone for a week, turn around and come back, because they weren't making any progress at all, and they knew they would run out of food, so they would come back.
Okay, then you.
So maybe to get back to Lou's question, in my process of publication, I talked about show me versus tell me, and then I talked about the self-publishing process. Right now, the marketing process takes up a lot of time.
Yeah.
It really is difficult, so thank you.
Well, they did mention back to the.
One more question.
Are you writing another book?
People ask me that a lot, actually. I did a book club yesterday, a conversation with a book club, and it was absolutely great. There were 7 ladies in the book club, and we had a conversation for about an hour and 45 minutes, I think. It was fabulous, and that was one of the questions. I'm not sure I have the energy, but I do have some ideas. And I do have some ideas.
We
So,
can't forget, I'm sorry.
Okay, one more thing. So if anybody's in a book club or knows of somebody in a book club or anybody online who's in a book club, let's talk about doing a meeting with your club. And so you can email me at briarhill@gmail.com, and that would get to me. Okay.
Begin. Goes left to right.
He folded this up right there. Well, you tell me.
It's 9 because I marked the 6 on the bottom.
Okay, it's a 9.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9. That table right there.
Oh, 1 on 3.
We still have to draw the number of the winner. If you draw a higher than 3, let's put it in another one. Oh, there's one online question and he got the drawing and he is the winner. Bruce Benke.
Bruce Benke, who's actually my granddaughter's godfather. Draw another one.
Draw another one. We're drawing one for the table.
Bruce already has a couple. Actually.
All right.
Sorry, Bruce.
A little unfair, but anyway.
I have to get below 3, right?
Yeah. 3 or both.
Whoops. That one's going back in. Number 2.
2.
Yeah.
Yeah.